Hi, everybody. Welcome to Mesh. Joining us now on the debate, Ann Cavoukian, Ontario's Information and Privacy Commissioner; Matthew Ingram, columnist at GigaOM and a Mesh co-founder; David Fewer, Director of the Canadian Internet Policy and Public Interest Clinic; Joseph Menn, technology reporter with the Financial Times and the author of Fatal System Error; and Alan Sawyer with the digital media company Two Solitudes Consulting. For those of you watching from home, we have other ways for you to get involved in our broadcast and participate. Our fifth column blogger, Mike Miner, is hosting a live chat online at tvo.org/theagenda. So please drop in there and participate, or you can send us a tweet on Twitter at twitter.com/theagenda, and we would ask that you use the hashtag YourAgenda. And those of you, we should let you know, we are live at 1:20 in the afternoon Eastern Time from Mars here in the Discovery District in downtown Toronto. And those of you watching online, we want to welcome you because we are live streaming this broadcast this afternoon as well. Matthew Ingram, we've been on the air 2 minutes. You haven't live tweeted that you're doing this yet. What's wrong?
I wasn't sure whether I should or not.
It's absolutely, if it's not appropriate to do it at this conference, it never will be. So feel free. Tweet away. Okay, Commissioner, let me start with you. Do internet companies like Facebook and Google control too much of our personal information?
The problem is that control is in the wrong hands. Control should reside with the individual. Privacy is all about the ability to control your data flows of information, personal information relating to you. The Germans call it informational self-determination. So control should reside with the individual about what information you want to impart and share. It's that simple. You, not the companies. And Matthew, how much control do we have right now versus others?
I think we have more control than we used to, and I think we're actually getting more control all the time. The hard part is that the more control you have, I think the more complicated it gets. It used to be a binary thing where you were private or public, or closer to binary. Now there's so many different settings. If you're talking about Facebook, there are different, and these tools are changing all the time. Twitter's changing, Facebook's changing, Flickr's changing, YouTube's changing. So you have to try and keep up with how those tools are changing and continually ask yourself, am I sharing things I don't want to?
Alan, where do you come down on that issue of control and how much we have versus how much we need?
I think one of the things we have to consider is that while we may have control over what we do with our information and what we put out there for our friends, we don't have control with what they do with the information. So it can cascade all over the place without you realizing it. And further, you know, if you're on Facebook or something like that and you've got your wall, your friends can put stuff on there that may not be something that you want to be associated with, but you really don't have easy control over that.
Joseph, what do you say?
Well, I think it's true that we have control, but the fact that it's so complicated means that most people don't follow through and do what they could. The fact that there are now third-party services that people are relying on Facebook to check their own privacy settings. It's very opaque, and it's a big problem.
Say that again.
There are third-party services that you can use. I forget some of the names of them. Would Privacy Protect is one, maybe?
And it shows all your settings.
People can't figure out what their own settings are, and they're having to. Facebook is making it so difficult that people are using these other services to see what's available about them. That's not a good sign.
Okay, David.
Yeah, I think it's a big problem. It's one thing to say you've got control over what information you put on the web. You might say, okay, I'm going to put item A and item B on the web. Then you've got two problems. One is, well, what happens then? And two is the third party out there saying, okay, we've got A and B, therefore C. And you may have not had any intention to disclose that information about you.
Gotcha. David Kirkpatrick's an author of a book called The Facebook Effect. Some of you may know it. He says that the company's core idea is, quote, radical transparency, which basically means we're all going to be better off if we lead a life that is radically transparent. We make ourselves more and more transparent. Not only will we be better off, but society will also be better off. And what do you say to that?
It's nonsense. I mean, it drives me crazy, those terms. Let's get real about what transparency is all about. Transparency is about getting the government and private sector organizations to be transparent about their operations, their practices. With the government, they're using publicly funded dollars, basically our money. So of course they should be transparent in terms of their policies and procedures and administration. That's what transparency relates to, the practices of these kind of organizations, not individuals. Individuals individuals determine their own choices as to how much information to reveal about themselves or not. Transparency has nothing to do with individuals. That domain is private. That's where personal information and the protection of personal information relating to your privacy relate. Let us not confuse transparency with privacy. They're completely separate. We do want, the one interest privacy has is, from a privacy perspective, we want to know what the practices are, the data collection practices of companies such as Facebook and Google and others, so that we can know what we can do with the information. What are they doing with our information? That's where you want transparency, not individuals being required to be transparent. Excuse me, we still live in a free society. Freedom is about freedom of choice. You, the individual, gets to choose how much information to impart and to whom. Not your mother, not your boss, not Facebook, not anybody else.
Matthew.
I think Anne's got a good point, but Facebook's philosophy, I think, is it's not like Facebook came up with that idea. That's the philosophy behind social media, period. That by sharing things with other people, you get benefits, as obviously there are risks, but you get benefits as well. So I think what people are responding to is the feeling that they're being forced to do that, not that they get to choose to do that. But I don't think you can disregard that there are lots of benefits to being on Facebook, to sharing your information with people, to updating them on your status. I mean, 400, 500 million people would not be doing it if it didn't have benefits.
Okay, having said that, Joseph, do you think there's something to what this guy's, I know Anne is very much opposed to his notion of transparency, but do you think Kirkpatrick's got something going here when he says if we all lived in a radically more transparent way, society would be better off?
I think that's called a panopticon, and it's a horrible dystopia wherein everybody sees what everybody is doing at the same time, and it's a terrible way to live. I can't imagine wanting to live like that.
Okay, get off the fence and tell me what you really think, okay?
I just wrote a book about Russian mobsters and American mobsters. I don't want them to have easy access to everything about me right now. I don't know why. There may be some people that feel like sharing absolutely everything in the world, but there are plenty of good reasons to keep things segregated. There are some things my work colleagues should know. There's some things that my personal friends should know. I think it's interesting that this stuff gets opted more and more public for us as Facebook grows in market clout, and and the lock-in potential grows. As they get more powerful, they're making more of our information available to everybody, and I don't think that's a coincidence.
Alan, let's look at this trend. You've got Facebook, you've got Google's attempt to create a social media network, Buzz. You've got other services as well. Is our privacy online receding as steadily as it seems?
I would say yes, that it absolutely is. And that's in part because unless you take the proactive steps to ensure that your data is somewhat contained, they're making decisions on your behalf on how your information is used and shared and propagated throughout the internet and picked up by search engines, and things that seem like simple little casual tweets become part of the permanent record of the National Library of Congress. These are not decisions that are being made on an informed basis by the consumer. They're being done for them by big business, and one of the things is particularly if you're a young person, you're socially marginalized if you don't participate in social networking. But if you do, you're putting stuff out there that's going to potentially come back to haunt you 30, 40, 50 years from now.
Give me an example of that. What could a teenager put on today that really could be so dangerous 40 years from now?
Well, we have to, looking at that, you have to know what the social mores 40 or 30 years and hence are. But even today, I mean, just a kid putting on there, a teenager that, that skipped school and got drunk and this sort of thing, that can have immediate ramifications with their parents who happen to be following them on Facebook, but also 10 years later, prospective employers looking at it and say, okay, that characterizes the behavior of this person when they were younger. That's probably how they still behave.
Is that a legitimate concern, David?
I think it is for sure. You especially see it in areas like politics, where all of a sudden you're putting your position out there for public consumption. Now, I don't think we want a world where we can say, well, wait a minute, you were out there in, way back in 2010, holding the placard for this cause or for that cause. How can you possibly stand here and, hold yourself out to be a representative of the people or a representative of these views? I mean, we want to give, some people call it the power or the right to forget. Right? We want to give people the ability to control that kind of information about themselves.
Okay, but Anne, humor me on this for a second. Once upon a time, if you were running for office and you admitted that you'd smoked grass at some point in your life, that was considered, you know, you were unfit for public office if that were the case. Now, of course, people running for office today, you know, grew up in the 60s, and if they didn't do it, they would be considered odd for some reason. If we live our lives radically more transparently, 30 years from now, won't it simply be the case that in the same way we kind of regard dope smoking today, that, okay, it doesn't render you unfit for office? You don't think that?
I don't think so. The reason is, if you look at historical events, and I always point to the time of the Third Reich and the Stasi police, and there are times, and you can't anticipate when they're going to be, where information that you think is harmless can be used against you in ways that you cannot contemplate, because it reflects a different complexion of time and things have changed. So I think to anticipate what information may be used and what may not and what's harmful is very difficult and very dangerous to engage in. I think it's really important to allow individuals to make conscious decisions about how to do this, but also bearing in mind, we are essentially social animals. So in the context of Facebook, I totally get why people want to connect. In my former days, I was a psychologist, and I always say we're social animals. We have a deep, intense need to connect, but equally, we have an intense need to remain private and have moments of solitude and intimacy and just private times. And the ability to decide, that's what characterizes freedom. And freedom of choice is essential to this. So to assume for others that they can decide for you and put it all out there and who cares and it's not going to come back and bite you. It will come back and bite you, but I can't predict when and in what context. So you have to be able to make those decisions yourself.
Gotcha. Alan?
That's like when the McCarthy era happened in the United States.
Yes, good example.
You know, people who had joined the Communist Party as young adults experimenting with politics and maybe made what was considered by many at the time to be an inappropriate choice in retrospect. But that came back to bite people terribly. And we have no way of knowing when governments are going to shift and we're going to find ourselves in a completely different non-freedom type world. And, you know, you mentioned Nazi Germany, you know, persecution of homosexuals was an example. Well, now people are very open about their homosexuality, but that's got to be a matter of choice, not a decision that's made for them by social networking or Facebook or things like that on how widely it's spread, how it's archived, and how it can come back to bite you in the ass.
Gotcha. Matthew?
I think that one of the things that occurs to me, you know, as I look more and more at Facebook and how, you know, some of the concerns that we're talking about, I look around, we're all old, right? No,
we're all
no
what,
offense.
sorry?
We're all old.
What's he talking about?
I know everybody else
I know
of the
you
guests
look
today is
surprisingly
saying,
young.
speak for yourself. I know that's what they're all saying.
But my point is, I wonder, and I don't know, but I wonder whether we aren't finding new ways to think about privacy. So if it isn't becoming a much more fluid concept than it used to be. So it's no longer, I want to be private about everything, or I want to be, and not that people can't obviously take that position, but I wonder if people who are growing up in an age of social media where you tweet and you text and you take photos and videos and you post things and you share things, whether that isn't changing the way we think about, the way our kids think about privacy.
Okay, let me just remind everybody, we are here at MESH, which is Canada's Web Conference. We're at the Mars Discovery District in downtown Toronto. We have 5 guests, some of whom have come from very near, some of whom from San Francisco very far. And we're talking about online privacy, which is one of the, well, I'm sure Ann Cavoukian would tell us is one of the key unresolved huge issues of our time. And I want to follow up with the business angle right now. We should also remind everybody we're live streaming this on our website, tvo.org/theagenda. Mike Miner's hosting an online chat, so go to the website, tvo.org/theagenda, and participate if you like that way as well in the online chat, email, tweet, whatever you like. Why, okay, Joseph, to you, why are companies so eager to make our information more and more visible?
Well, it's a mix of reasons. I mean, they want the information, in Facebook's case, they want it so they can sell advertising, charge more money for it. It's, you know, if you want to reach everybody on Facebook, you can charge one thing. If you want to reach just 30-year-old car owners, you can, in California, you can charge more. So that's the simplest reason. Facebook's case, it gets more interesting because we don't know what all the applications are doing with that information. Now, one of the recent changes in Facebook is it used to be that the application providers could only hold on to your information for 24 hours. Now there's no limit. And we don't know. I mean, it could be a 1 million strong for cupcakes on Wednesday, and they're taking that information and doing who knows what with it. So there's a second layer. There's a number of layers to remove, and we don't know what's happening to our information. Google and Facebook, among others, they want that information to serve you better. If they know what you searched for in the past, they can, guess that you're searching for something similar in the future. And the same thing with targeting ads. So they can be more efficient as a business the more they know about you.
Is this, Ellen, that much more nefarious than, say, when you go to a department store and even if you pay cash, they want to know your address, they want to know what postal code you're from because they're trying to get a profile of you as a consumer in the hopes of doing some of these things? Is this that much worse?
Well, it is, because you're actually giving away a lot more information through social media than you do when you're simply giving out your postal code or something like that to a merchant. And you can easily, on the spot, on a case-by-case basis, make the decision to not give the merchant that information. The other thing we've got to look at, too, is who is collecting the data. If you buy something at a Canadian merchant, it's a Canadian business collecting that information for use in Canada. When you give that information to Facebook and Google, you're giving it up to an American company. And in fact, if you look at any of these companies that are accumulating a lot of information about us, American companies know Canadians much better than any Canadian company does now, or than the government, perhaps a good thing. But, we're losing control over who knows what about us. It's not in our own national hands.
Okay, but David, if they want that information because it will help profile us insofar as we're a 30-year-old car lover of whatever, red cars from California, and we want that kind of information, isn't that to our benefit that they have that information?
Well, it can be. I mean, it can provide consumers with better information. Part of the issue is, does the consumer want these unknown people to have that kind of profile of them? Perhaps I have no problem with, I don't know, with the car company figuring out that perhaps I'm not their target market. Maybe I shouldn't be getting all these ads that I don't want. Maybe there's a company that I would have a different view of. But part of the issue is it's not just targeting, right? It's not just targeted advertisements. It's all sorts of other things. Building data banks of information for profiling purposes, that's one. For doing I guess a range of marketing-related research on consumers that consumers may want to participate in or may not want to participate in.
Matthew, talk to us about the cloud. I know everybody in this room knows what the cloud is, but some of our viewers may not. What's the cloud? How secure is the information in the cloud?
Well, the cloud is a term that people came up with because they didn't want to keep saying infrastructure or, distributed web or whatever. But it's the idea that Google and Facebook and lots of social tools and services don't actually store your data. Usually it's in their server networks, some of which are hosted by Amazon or some of which are hosted by Google. So your data doesn't live in a specific place. It's a little like money used to be. You used to be able to go to the bank and say, I want to see my money, not someone else's money, because they had it in a room. But now money is just bits, and they exist nowhere. And your data is exactly the same. So
and how secure is the information there?
Well, that's an excellent question. I think it's not only how secure it is, it's what it is. Google just finished admitting that it was actually capturing all this data from public Wi-Fi networks while it was driving around taking, street view photos. So it's taking photos of the street, which some people have a privacy issue with. Meanwhile, it's collecting sort of IP address data from public Wi-Fi networks, but it accidentally did that and forgot to tell people. So it's not just the stuff they're collecting that they know they're collecting and who gets it, it's what's kind of you're emanating, this data is flowing out of you all the time, whether you know it or not.
And Cavoukian, has your office expressed any concerns about the status of the cloud and how secure the information is there?
We did a paper on cloud computing about 2 years ago, identifying the various areas of concern and areas where we need to especially address our particular attention. And one of the prevailing things when you think of cloud computing, and it's the notion that the concept of control is getting more and more elusive, that we're losing control, we're getting farther, you don't even know where your information is going to be, there's federated management of your information. So the concept of data minimization is growing in strength, and by that I simply mean if you don't have to give your data in personally identifiable form to somebody, an organization, a company, or anything, don't do it. And the same message to businesses. Don't collect personally identifiable information if you don't have to. Because once you collect it in personally identifiable form, then there's a strong duty of care. You've got to keep this stuff secure. You've got to keep it private. You've got to restrict its use to that which you've identified to the data subject. All these additional responsibilities flow. So all of a sudden, cloud computing, which is this new catch-all term, but it encompasses all of these additional protections that are needed. So we have a term, concept that I developed a while back called privacy by design. And by that, we mean embed privacy into the design of whatever systems you're developing, into the infrastructure, right into the design specifications of the architecture, so that it's not an afterthought. You know, it's somewhere in the cloud and somebody thinks, oh, maybe we should bolt on some kind of protection. It's not going to work, first of all, and it's too late. So band-aid protections aren't going to work. Embed privacy into the design as the default, because as we know, the default is the prevailing condition in 80% of the time. Whatever the default condition is, that is going to prevail 80% of the time, and I want that to be privacy by design.
Okay, let's go, Joseph, a little further along the continuum from what we've been discussing to your area of expertise, which is cybercrime. Are people aware of the risks involved when they put personal information online? Do they understand that they could be, and you tell us how much, setting themselves up to being victims of cybercrime?
Well, it's making the bad guy's job a lot easier, that's for sure. You know, a lot of people use their pet's name as a password, which is okay unless you put the pet's name on your Facebook page. A lot of it, which happens an awful lot. It's much easier to social engineer somebody into clicking on a malicious link that will track their online banking passwords and good things like that through Facebook and other networks. The major attack that was disclosed by Google in January in China, which has caused an international stir, and rightly so, the way they got into Google systems was through a link sent by a friend. And so they figured they couldn't get to the Google engineer directly, but they looked at the networks and they saw who his friends were. Well, if that friend sent the Google engineer a link, he'd click on it, and he did. And we got in a whole mess of trouble over that. That's happening routinely now. A lot of the worst spyware, the banking trojans that are out there are spreading through social networks, and it's completely unchecked. So first of all, you can't assume that your friends are really your friends, because they could be, your friend might have had their account compromised. So and secondly, you're putting on, yes.
Inadvertently.
And secondly, you're putting on stuff there that the bad guys can use against you.
Give me a for instance on that. Bad guys being whom, using it how?
Well, one of the Kubeface, which is a very widespread piece of malware, it's an anagram of Facebook, takes over your account, spams all your friends, and says, hey, check out this great video. You click there, and there's a variety of payloads, as they're called in the trade, but one of them is fake antivirus software, where they take over your machine and they say, we've just done this free scan and found this terrible stuff. Pay us $25 with your credit card and it'll go away. And it doesn't do anything besides take your credit card number, and then your machine is now captive, and they'll use it. And
people really go for that? People
Hundreds of thousands of people go for that.
Hundreds of thousands of people go for that?
Yes, they do.
Okay. We should just let everybody know you're going to be on our program again tomorrow night, and we're going to delve into some of these issues in more depth as well. So don't go back to San Francisco until we've dealt with you.
All right.
Let's continue along here. Privacy commissioners from around the world, which I understand are getting together in the fall in Jerusalem. Right. In fact, led by one of your colleagues, Jennifer Stoddard, the Canadian Privacy Commissioner, apparently sent a letter to Google saying the internet giant was forgetting its privacy responsibilities. Are the commissioners right? Is Google forgetting its privacy responsibilities?
I'll get in trouble for this, but I would not have signed that letter. And the reason I disagreed with the letter is because, not that I took issue with the points that they raised in the letter, but I think you don't just raise privacy problems that you see with the lead company, which is Google. You also point to positive developments that they did. So you criticize them when they do stupid things, and then you applaud them when they do good things. So the example they used was Google Buzz, and I was among the first critics of Google Buzz. It was the dumbest design, because what they did was all people who had Gmail accounts, they thought, oh, wouldn't it be great? You send email to all these people through Gmail, we'll make them all part of your social contacts because you want to connect with them, right? Wrong. Very wrong. I mean, you might have some emails in there that are business associates or people, you contact once or twice that you have no intention of connecting with. So it was a flawed design, and as I said, I was on the phone and writing to them immediately when they did this. But I also visited with Google. I was in Palo Alto recently, and I met with the Google Buzz team who did this, and I said, what were you thinking? And they said, we didn't think about that. Obviously, all we were thinking about how to get people to connect more. That was our sole focus, obviously a mistake. But they also said within 48 hours, and I totally could see they did this, we worked night and day for 48 hours to introduce corrections to the system and respond to all the criticism we got.
So they were responsive.
They were very responsive. In 48 hours, they had it much better, much more controlled. You could exercise choice. I'm not saying it was perfect, but it was significant improvements in 48 hours, immediate turnaround time. No one mentioned that. And that's my problem, is I have no problem criticizing when you have to criticize, but then when they do the fix, applaud what they're doing, and that they did it in record time.
Alan, is this one of the situations where the social media are just so anxious to connect people? People seem to want to be connected, that they didn't see the forest for the trees here?
Well, I think it's partly that, but I think one thing that we seem to have lost sight of with these social media platforms is an age-old software concept called beta testing, where you actually test something on a small group, see how it works, see how they react.
That sounds so old-fashioned today, doesn't
and
it?
you get you get early adopters who want to do this, and they become your guinea pigs, and you find out how things are going to work and find out what's not going to work. And that just seems to have gone by the wayside, and they implement wholesale changes on Facebook that affect 500 million people almost overnight.
Matthew?
It's interesting that it's still just a theory, but part of my theory about why they rushed Buzz out, because Google is the king of beta testing. I mean, Gmail was in beta for 3 years or something like that. So then all of a sudden Buzz comes out without any beta testing at all. In fact, they didn't even do internal beta testing or dog food testing, which they usually do. And I think that's because they felt the pressure coming from Facebook. So Facebook was adding more and more features, more and more social features, and I think Google felt, we're missing the boat. People aren't going to connect through us, and so we need this thing. And then they just, rushed it out too soon.
David?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's actually what happened. Google saw Facebook coming by wanting to eat its lunch. If Google feels a lot of pressure, from Facebook. And so I think what you did get a little bit was a bit of a race to the bottom on privacy, which is exactly in the wrong direction that we want to be going. Now, that having been said, Google is usually a pretty good company on privacy, and a great example of this is what we were talking about on cloud computing before. What are the security issues with cloud computing? I mean, one of the issues is security of the data on the server, right? Is that encrypted? Is it not encrypted? Is it vulnerable to hacking? But another one is encryption in transit. So think about how we use, email today or Gmail. We sit in cafes, we sit in libraries. I come from a university, so we sit around drinking coffee a lot. And we do Facebook, we do Gmail. How much of this is encrypted? Turns out Gmail, a year ago, decided to encrypt all Gmail traffic, right? Market leader.
And thank you for pointing that out. And I should say that Gmail was very responsive to 35 of us wrote to Gmail on that, because it wasn't encrypted before that. It wasn't secure. You could opt in, you could select it, but it wasn't the default. And we wrote to them and we said, look, you got all these people on Gmail, you can make it secure, make that the default, make that the default for everybody. And to their credit, they did that. They were very responsive.
You've met Eric Schmidt, right, from Google?
No, I have not.
You met Zuckerberg, though?
Yes.
From Facebook?
Yes.
Does he get this stuff?
He'd like to get it.
It was a private conversation.
It was a private conversation.
No. He certainly understands the importance of privacy in terms of the value of it to individuals, and he speaks the language of control. And the test will be whether that translates into the actions of Facebook in terms of making control easy for its users. It's not that there aren't privacy protective measures available. There are, but they're not easy. They're getting more and more complicated. And a bewilderment of options, as the New York Times said. And so the problem becomes when you make this so complicated that it takes a PhD to figure out how to use it, it's not going to be used. It's the exact opposite of making privacy the default, and that's what we're seeking.
Gotcha. Joseph.
Yeah, a couple points. Somebody had the nice line, the devil's in the defaults, which is an idea that's been brought up here as opposed to the devil's in the details.
Yes.
And the important thing is that with Gmail made it, you could always do secure socket layer for mail, but they made it the default, and that's a very important step. Small corrective, you should note, it's great that everybody wrote the letters and urged them to do it. They didn't do it then. They only did it after the China hacks, which were in part aimed at getting into the email habits of dissidents. And then they said, as part of our general, we're going to take security a lot more seriously, then they flipped the switch there. So, I mean, that does show that defaults are extremely serious, and I think it's interesting the way Facebook's defaults have evolved over time in a not necessarily terrific direction.
Let me read a quote here from Michael Geist from the University of Ottawa, whom I'm sure all of you know, who wrote the following to the Toronto Star last month. As experts debated the importance of the Commissioner's letter to Google, the longer-term impact may come not from specific actions against companies such as Google. There does not appear to be much likelihood of imminent action, he wrote at the time, but rather from the realization that the joint effort may represent a major step towards the globalization of privacy enforcement. Does this, Matthew, require a globalized response?
I see Ann nodding.
I know what she's going to say. I want to go to you first.
I'm not convinced that it does, and even if it does, I'm not convinced that that's possible. If you look at what Germany's done, what Italy's done, I mean, Italy, convicted 3 Google executives of privacy infringement. No one else has even come close to doing that. So we certainly don't want them driving the bus if they're going to, I think there's so many disparities between the way countries look at privacy. Germany's upset about Street View and wants the ability for people to remove their images from it instantly, to be alerted when the car is coming, whatever. Those things are, I think even if you did agree that that was a valuable thing, I don't think there's any likelihood of it ever happening.
I'm going to make Ann squirm some more because I'm going to go to Alan first. Go ahead, Alan. What do you say on this?
Well, I think we've lost enough control of our digital sovereignty already as a nation that I think abdicating how we control privacy to an intergovernmental body from a multinational consortium of government privacy people is absolutely the wrong way to go. I think we have to control our own destiny, and we're doing a very poor job of it, but we've got to do whatever we can to retain what little control we have.
And here are 2 people who will not be going to your conference in Jerusalem, I'm guessing.
And I applaud them for not coming, because I couldn't agree with you more. Privacy is about exercising personal responsibility and making choices for how you want your information used, to the extent that you can exert that influence, and sometimes you can't. So I totally agree with you. But on the Privacy Commissioner's thing, I mean, with respect to what Michael Geist was saying, I don't agree with that, because we've been doing this for years. I mean, there is an International Privacy Commissioners Conference once a year, usually in Europe. This year it's in Jerusalem. And we speak together all the time. We're communicating. And while there are a lot of regional differences, of course, in the specific statutes, there's something called fair information practices, which consist of privacy principles that are embedded in all privacy laws and privacy policies. And the bottom line is control, that you specify to the individual what information you want to collect, that you as a company or a government restrict your uses of the information to that purpose unless you have the individual's permission to use it for secondary purposes. It could be that simple, and it's that complicated. So I don't think this represents anything new. We have been doing this kind of global convergence in an attempt to harmonize our approach to things and have discussions, but you're going to have the kind of variations, the regional variations, there's no question. And bottom line, as much as we try to do our job in terms of oversight and compliance, it's going to be impossible. It's going to take over with the cloud and with information losing control. So individuals have to play a much larger role in terms of being responsible for their information flows.
Alan?
U.S. Patriot Act. That gives them the government access to any information that is residing in a U.S. server. Now, that's an extension of the normal privacy laws, and it's an exception circumstance, sort of like our War Measure Act was, once upon a time invoked. But the U.S. is not going to give that up. So if we try to have a global policy on privacy, it's going to be a common denominator kind of thing, and the U.S. Patriot Act is going to be part of it, and I'm not buying into that.
You're not. Let's do a couple of more things here before we go into the audience and take some questions. And just before we go here, let me just remind everybody watching us either online at tvo.org/theagenda or at home. Mike Miner's hosting an online chat on our website. We invite you to go there, send him your comments, your questions. Feel free as well to email us or send your tweets. You're really showing great discipline. You have not tweeted once, Matthew. I'm very impressed. Anyway, we're here at MESH in downtown Toronto at the Mars Discovery District, taking in Canada's Web Conference and talking about online privacy today. What I'm about to read may sound funny. It's not, but it is, I mean, let me just read it. There are sites dedicated to showing how little common sense people actually use online. There's a site called Please Rob Me, and it listed tweets that revealed when people weren't home. They've shut it down. They said they made their point. Facebook Search recently launched, scouring Facebook for disastrous indiscretions, also just to prove a point. Matthew, are social media sites really just indiscretion engines?
Sure they are. I mean, sure they are. The internet is a giant indiscretion engine. I mean, it's not like sharing this stuff just happened when Facebook and Twitter came along. People have been, emailing each other terrible things and pictures and showing horrible personal things for decades. People have been on news groups. People have, the internet allows you to share whatever you want, including the stuff you shouldn't be sharing, including the things you did when you were drunk. I mean, that's what the internet does. And so, that's bad, obviously, in some ways, but it also does a lot of good.
Well, that's the other question. Joseph, does the innovation justify the loss of privacy?
Well, the innovation's been tremendous. I mean, it's a huge engine in the world economy, and it would be nice if it stayed that way. I think security and privacy concerns are so great now that it actually might begin to put a bit of a brake on development, and that's unfortunate. I don't think it's going to be because people were too open about their hangovers. I think it's going to be because their credit card information is in the hands of plenty of criminals. I think that's the bigger concern. And
Anne, based on your study and your knowledge of this, how much digital literacy do we as a society have to know about these issues of privacy we're talking about today?
Not enough. That's a problem. People don't think. People love to connect. I get that. I'm very social. But the problem is once you have this and you don't think before you post, you send all this information and it's going out there in ways that you cannot retrieve and you haven't thought of. Professor Avner Levin at Ryerson University has a term called network privacy. And by that, he's talking about kids today. And it's not true that kids no longer have a sense of privacy, but the sense of privacy has evolved. So somehow network privacy is using that term to capture that kids somehow think that as long as they impart information to their friends and their network of associates, that's cool, it's private. But somehow they're indignant when others outside of the network get the information, like, of course, but they haven't thought that through. And that's the problem. It's you don't make the connections. And we have to find ways of being able to do both.
And I guess the BFF today isn't necessarily going to be the BFF forever, are they? Yeah. Okay, let's go into our audience and get some feedback from here. Go ahead, sir.
Hi, my question is that, well, my point, I think, is that this is all, you've got privacy and you've got to take ownership of it, but this is all about creating your personal brand. And it's just like merges across. You've got to take responsibility for this, and you've got to manage what is seen about yourself online, create a brand, and take control of how the internet and everybody else sees you. And privacy is just a cornerstone of actually making your presence control how you're seen and generally just adapted that way. So what do you think of that?
Who do you want that to in particular? Anybody?
No, just generally to the panel.
Okay, Alan, go ahead.
I'd agree with that entirely, but I'd also like to point out that even as a mature, not old person, I'm still learning how to do that myself in social media, and I spend a lot of time thinking about the implications of this. Other people, teenagers, people who are not digital natives or digitally literate, really don't assess the consequences of that sort of brand management, as you say, and will do severe damage to their brand before they actually realize the consequences. But yeah, I agree with your statement.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to add to that. The brand that a 16-year-old have is not that same person's brand 10 years later, or 20 years later, or 30 years later. Also, I mean, how do you tell a 16-year-old that, you know, you've got to manage your brand better?
And precisely for that reason, because they can't do it very well, there are companies developing like Reputation Defender, or parents are hiring Reputation Defender once their kids get out of university and are looking for a job to go online and clean up all the stuff out there in the social media, because there's no way they're going to get a job without all of that information out there. So it's very difficult to manage your brand, especially when you're at an age where you don't know the significance of doing so.
Okay, over here, please.
So the way social networks work is that the more you put into it, the more friends you have, the more value you extract out of it. But the problem is the choice is binary when you don't like what you see on those social networks, whether it's privacy or else. So you either pack up and go somewhere else, or you close your account. How much has been done for people to be able to pack their data and take it somewhere else? And how much pressure is being put on these social networks to take care of that?
Matthew?
That's a great question, and I think it's something that more and more people are thinking about, or should be thinking about. Not just, you know, what is Facebook doing with my data, but how can I take my data with me if I decide to go somewhere else? How can I take whatever Google has? How can I take what Facebook has? How can I take what Twitter has? And I think that there is more pressure being applied to those companies to be better about giving it to you if you want it, instead of just saying, you know, you cancel your account, we'll just keep all this stuff, and we promise we'll delete it. And I think the prospect of an open source solution like, say, Diaspora, which is relatively recent, but wants to be a kind of open, federated version of Facebook, the potential there is, if you decide you don't want to stick with the walled garden, you could potentially take your data with you and move it somewhere else.
Joseph, can I just ask a hopelessly naive question here? Is this the currency of the day, that the more friends you have, the more valuable and valued you are as a person in teenage land these days? Is that how it works?
Not absolutely. I mean, there's, you know, unfortunately, the rise of social networks has turned all of our future lives into like a continuation of high school in some respects. But there's also, you know, the quality of your friendships, and there are some people that will accept any and all friends, including spam bots that want to be their friends. You know, that cute girl on Twitter that wants to follow you is who mysteriously doesn't have any followers of her own. Yeah, she's not a cute girl. Yeah, I know her. I've asked. It is a criteria, and it is a factor, and there is sort of social pressure to do more. I actually want to go back to the first question and say that, yes, people should have control and they should manage their privacy appearance, but they can't be expected to drop everything and spend 3 hours on it in the middle of the workday, and that's what we have to do sometimes. Yeah. And that's really not fair to us, the users.
Okay. Can I just, first of all, thank you for coming today. This is the best example of color-coordinated hair and device. Here, hold up your device here. Look at that. Like that, the device is pink, the hair is pink. This is beautiful. Okay. Sorry, you wanted to ask.
So in 2009, Mark Zuckerberg was quoted as saying, "Having two identities for yourself is an example of a lack of integrity." This is at the core of this ideology of radical transparency, and what makes it really problematic is that there are lots of legitimate reasons to have more than one identity. Say you're queer and your boss is homophobic, or your politics are otherwise different from your friends. There are a lot of legitimate reasons, and people have suffered real-world consequences from the loss of privacy in, say, the recent April 2010 Facebook privacy changes. How do we reconcile this real need for people to be able to have segmented identities like that with the kinds of privacy challenges we're running into with technologies like Facebook?
Now that's a fascinating different angle on this. Okay. Anne, you want to start on that, and then we'll go to David?
I agree that the ability to have, I call them pseudonyms instead of multiple identities, but pseudonyms in the context of social media should be something that is permitted for a number of the reasons you identified. Facebook has had a policy that you have to have your actual identity online, and that's how you use Facebook, and you have to identify yourself to them and to your friends. they have been pressed, especially by the European Union. Many of the German commissioners have pressed them to allow the use of pseudonyms. So yes, you have to identify yourself to Facebook, so you have a real relationship with them, but then the face that you are permitted to use publicly, you should be able to use pseudonyms to communicate publicly. I personally support that, and I think there are many reasons why you might want to enter into different discussions with different pseudonyms. Having said that, I also understand why you don't want complete anonymity, because sometimes you can hide behind that in terms of engaging in activities that Facebook may not want to be associated with, etc. So I think the two-phase linkage, real identity to Facebook, and then the use of pseudonyms, various pseudonyms publicly, should be permitted.
David.
Yeah, I mean, Lee's comments just skewered Zuckerberg's comment. When I read that, I mean, I was outraged. I mean, that's a morally bankrupt statement, in my view. Of course we have different personas.
Whoops, one sec. You don't have a microphone, but you said it's a reflection of having a huge amount of social privilege.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, of course we have different personas, and yes. Lee's discussion gave a few great examples.
It's interesting that Mark Zuckerberg, at one point, I don't know if he still does, had a semi-private Facebook page using a fake name.
I was going to say, I think there was no K in Zuckerberg. He had a bogus profile and a real profile for his actual friends. It's pretty hypocritical that he says none of us should be doing that.
What was the explanation for doing that?
I don't think he
just
ever
that he wanted a page for just his friends.
For just his real friends?
Yeah.
As opposed to his Facebook friends?
Instead of his 500 million followers.
Okay. Alan, you wanted to say.
I was just going to say that if you are going to set up multiple personas, use different email addresses for them, because that's the most common aggregator of information on all these social networks, across these networks, is it all links back, in many cases, to your Gmail address or something like that, that allows people to pull a lot of data together. So if you want to separate your identity into different worlds, set up a new email address for that, so it's harder for it to be federated behind your back.
Let me double back into the issue of education. And if, there's no way, we're not that old, Matthew, but when we all went to high school, we didn't learn about things like recycling, and I mean, they just don't do that back then. They didn't do it back then. They do it routinely today in the education system. Are you telling us that, in the education, in the education system of today or of tomorrow, our children are going to be learning about these kinds of privacy issues as a matter of routine in class?
I certainly hope so. We started now. We work with the Ministry of Education. We're part of the curriculum. So my office has developed curriculum material. And we not only have materials in the schools that are taught in various classes, various grades. I go into schools regularly and I talk to kids about specifically Facebook and online social media. And it's really fun to do because you connect with all these kids, but you can just gauge the audience. So there's an assembly, it's like 800 kids. And I was talking to girls, all-girls school once, and I was talking to them about sexting. So sexting is you take a picture of yourself with your mobile phone, a naked picture of yourself, you're 14, 15, you're beautiful, and you send that to your boyfriend, who you love, and of course, who isn't going to show anybody. Well, of course, he sends it to 50 of his closest buddies. And I'm giving this example, and I said, I'm sure none of you have probably ever done this, but if you've ever done this, and then you've probably broken up with a boyfriend in 6 months, or you may, and then I see 3 girls and their jaws have dropped because it never occurred to them that if they take a picture of themselves naked and send it to their boyfriend, he's going to send it to anybody else. Think about it, the maturity of kids. I mean, they're young. So this kind of educating, and I never tell them, don't do it. I just say, please think very carefully what this may mean also to future implications. You've got to think through some of the consequences before you post. And so we give them a list of things, a checklist of things that to go through and think, and I do a before and after. And when these kids are leaving, they're all going to set their privacy settings on Facebook or wherever, because they get the impact once it's pointed out to them. So I think education is critical as a formal part of our curriculum.
Not to be stereotypical or mean, but what 14 or 15-year-old in love thinks clearly?
Precisely, that's my point. That's why they need to.
But do they listen to what you say? I wonder if it just goes right over their heads.
Oh, I'm sure many of them don't. But I also know, because I get a lot of emails back from these kids through their principals and their teachers, that a lot of them say, oh, thanks so much for telling me that I went back and I checked and then I restricted my settings to these 3 people or this level. So I get very gratifying emails suggesting certainly that some of them have listened and have heard the messaging.
Matthew, based on what you know, how much digital literacy is happening, particularly in the area of online privacy in our schools today?
I think it's still very, very early days. I mean, it's like the early days of recycling or, anti-smoking or whatever. I think it is, and more so than just schools, I think it's something that parents have to think about. It's just the same way you try and teach your kid to, don't go to a party with a guy whose last name you don't even know, in a place you've never heard of before. I mean, you try to teach them skills that allow them to live in modern society. Well, living on the internet and having a lot of your content out there is something you are going to be doing, whether you want to or not. And I think that parents have to start thinking about how they're helping their kids deal with that.
During the course of the program, we've been putting tweets up on the big screen here in the hall. We do need to start teaching privacy to our kids. One person tweets, it starts at home and it starts young.
Yes.
That's what you all seem to be saying here. Alan.
Well, I think one of the things too is that we need parents to teach their children, but we need to educate the parents. And the parents themselves don't know. They didn't grow up in this world.
Right.
It's all new to them. It's constantly changing. Every month Facebook changes something and there's some new exposure. How do we expect them to teach children if we can't keep them informed, can't keep ourselves informed?
That's a good point, David.
Yeah, I mean, there's a real capacity problem here. I mean, I look at my kids' teachers. They're not going to be teaching my kids about Facebook. I mean, I'm sorry. We talk about, parents teach your children well. Unfortunately, in this space, it's the opposite. Kids are able to teach their parents what's going on. So how on earth do we teach privacy in this space? It means parents have to immerse themselves in an environment, a digital environment that they're not necessarily comfortable with.
And
If you go to our website, we have a number of educational materials freely available to the public.
tell us what the URL is.
www.ipc.on.ca.
IPC, Information Privacy Commission.on.ca.
Yes.
And there are materials there.
There are materials, and there's brochures that you can hand out to your kids, and there's different levels of materials and educational things for parents as well. I've done sessions with parents at their request, so happy to share that with you.
Is this conversation happening in the United States?
It is,
Yeah.
and it'll increasingly happen more in the United States. I mean, what we need is parents to learn from their kids and kids to educate the parents, and vice versa. It needs to happen at the same time. And I wish, I wish every parent had that kind of time to devote to it, but I think it is happening. There's certainly an increasing awareness of privacy, and there's new research that suggests it's not a strict generational thing, that
right.
teens do care as much about privacy as their parents have. And I think there's a misconception out there that teens will just let everything go and not think about it. I think they do care. They might not have realized how far it's going.
That whole parents learning from their kids and kids learning from their parents, I think, though, is harder to do in an era when parents call their kids for dinner by tweeting them. That's apparently how it happens nowadays. Anyway, it's good of all of you to join us here at MESH this afternoon in downtown Toronto. Really great discussion today on online privacy. Thank you all very much.